He was the second youngest among 12 brothers who were born from 3 different mothers, and the only one given a special ornate robe by their father, and was said to be his father's most loved son. You might say there was some capacity for sibling rivalry built into the family system. When he had a divinely inspired dream about one day ruling over his brothers and chose to share the interpretation with them, the sibling rivalry turned lethal. One day when Joseph was about 17 years old and was in the isolation of the fields with the flocks and the herds and the brothers, they plotted to kill Joseph and blame it on attacks by wild animals. But they could not all agree, and so they chose to throw him into a cistern and just tell their father he was killed and offer his robe with blood on it as compelling evidence. Of course, his father was devastated by the news. Meanwhile, Joseph was discovered by others in the cistern who sold him into slavery. He was taken to Egypt, where he would not see his family again for a very, very long time. He served Potiphar, a high-ranking Egyptian official, and served there until there was an incident with the wife of Potiphar who took an interest in Joseph. While he tried to keep a righteous life, Potiphar's wife was really okay with not being so righteous. And when Joseph rejected her advances, she charged him with acting inappropriately towards her and had him thrown into prison. From near death at the hands of his brothers, being abandoned and thrown into a pit, then sold into slavery, then unjustly being thrown into prison, Joseph's life was not going well, and because of no wrongdoing on his part. Thus far, it was the epitome of someone getting a raw deal in life. But Joseph did not allow it to become his pity me story. He did not become bitter and continued to make the best of the difficult circumstances that he was in. In fact, in prison, he became known as a very wise man and interpreter of dreams. He had a good relationship with the prison guards and the other prison inmates, and as other prisoners came and went, Joseph developed a reputation. In fact, it was through one of these former prisoner contacts that Joseph was eventually released and found his freedom. You see, the Pharaoh was troubled by dreams that he could not make sense of, and his regular wise men and advisors were not much help either. But when Joseph was brought to him and properly interpreted the dream for him, the Pharaoh was so impressed that he made him second in command and head administrator of all of Egypt. Sometime later, the dream interpretation was fulfilled with 7 years of abundance of food and 7 years of famine. During the famine, the people of other nations came to Egypt, where under Joseph's administration, there was grain and food stored up in advance to be sold during the times of drought. As famine struck the land of Joseph's family and former home, his father Jacob sent his brothers to Egypt to buy food as well. They did not recognize him at first. How could they? He was much older. He was dressed like an Egyptian, and they certainly did not expect to see him there. But he recognized them. And privately, Joseph got very emotional. He had not seen them for many years now, and the last time that he did, they were trying to kill him or abandon him in the wilderness and leave him for dead. Through some carefully staged conversations with interpreters and situations, Without revealing his identity, Joseph caused them to go and return with Benjamin, the youngest brother, and then, in negotiating for the coming of his father Jacob to Egypt, he finally revealed his identity to them, and they were terrified. They knew this head of the Egyptian palace, this administrator of Egypt who had great power over them, was in fact their brother whom they had been incredibly cruel to and even criminal towards. This is what it says in this reunion in Genesis 45. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. And then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there have been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, 'This is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me. You, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute.' Joseph then sent them to his father Jacob, also called Israel. And after this tearful scene of reconciliation, they went with supplies and carts to help in the family and livestock relocation to a good land in Egypt called Goshen. And there was peace and provision for Jacob and his sons and their families in Egypt during the times of drought." Perhaps more than any other character in the Old Testament, Joseph's life demonstrates for us that even in the very worst of circumstances, despite the worst of human sins and behaviors towards us, despite all of the opposition that might get in the way of what God's good will would otherwise be for us and for those around us, the message is that God's will ultimately be fulfilled anyway. The theological word for that is providence. If it hadn't been for the abuse and abandonment that Joseph experienced as a young man, the family would have otherwise been lost to the drought. Not that God caused the brothers to be so evil towards Joseph, or couldn't work out another way of salvation otherwise, but God allowed them to use their free will to make their sinful choices and activities, and yet somehow brought good and redemption out of it. Their evil intent resulted in Joseph's relocation and leadership role in Egypt, and ended up being the means of his family's salvation from starvation in a time of drought, and the salvation of the people of Egypt as well from the same. In Joseph's words from today's reading in chapter 50, verse 20, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Now, in the middle of Joseph's life story, when Joseph went from pit to slavery to prison, it's doubtful that he could foresee anything good coming from that. I'm sure that at the time he would have been happy just to be out of prison. While we can't always see or fully know about God's purposes for the events of our lives, sometimes particularly when having the benefit of hindsight, especially long-term hindsight, and by the way, the older you get, the more longer term becomes your hindsight. And we may know to a degree God's providential will in our lives. God's end game for Joseph's life was the preservation of his chosen people, the growing people of Israel. But so often in mid-course, the end game of God for us can seem very unclear or hidden from us. Long seasons of suffering or fear or hardship may at times lead us to question if God has any end game in mind at all. Because there is a lot that we cannot see or know about God's bigger picture, about how things look from his perspective. We can't always connect meaning with our life's events, particularly the ones filled with suffering and loss. This is a piece of a jigsaw puzzle that I tried to do while on vacation at the Frio River a couple weeks ago. It looks like a jutting shape with colors and lines that really don't make a whole lot of sense when you just look at the piece by itself. But a lot of times, that's all we get to see. And we don't get to see the big picture. But when some of the other pieces get connected and the images begin to connect with each other and these odd shapes seem to link together, we seem to get a bigger sense of where this might fit into a bigger picture, a larger overarching purpose to things. We might get a sense of how our one small piece fits into a bigger whole. One thing we never seem to forget, we never seem to have, is God's bigger picture of things. Only he knows that. In this case, it was a beautiful picture of birds and nature. And this was just a small piece of a beautiful picture. Kind of like seeing the backside of a tapestry. The front reveals a great, wonderful, ornate picture. On the back, there's just a bunch of crazy threads running all over the place. Only God really knows how all these things connect and work together for the glory of his greater picture. Only God knows his hand of providence that is bringing about good from evil, redemption from brokenness. And even in the difficult circumstances where I cannot see, I can still trust that God has an end game for that situation too. Theologian Thomas Oden and others have drawn the metaphor of understanding God's power at work providentially in the world as that of a parent. He writes, "Faith in providence places its active reliance upon the permitting, restraining, overruling, and preventing power of God's infinitely good parenting." During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln wrote a letter about the great trial that he and the nation had been under, how he desired all his works and acts to be according to God's will, and yet admitted how the prolonged time of the losses and hardships of war were difficult to accept. He writes this, "If I had my way, this war would never have been commenced. If I had been allowed my way, this war would have been ended before this. But we find it still continues, and we must believe that he permits it for some wise purpose of his own, mysterious and unknown to us. And though with our limited understandings we may not be able to comprehend it, yet we cannot but believe that he who made the world still governs it. That is faith in providence. That is doing your very best in faith no matter what, and leaving the rest up to God, even when we don't fully understand the meaning of our difficult situations or how it might fit into a larger picture for the good. And yet the scriptures tell us that ultimately God is in control, that his holy will eventually be done, and that the end game is God's will for the good, for the redemption of his people and the world, and that he is actively directing history toward that end. Ephesians 1 adds to this idea. In him we were also chosen, having been predestined according to the plan of him who works everything in conformity with the purpose of his will, in order that we who were the first to hope in Christ might be for the praise of his glory. That everything is somehow being worked into conformity with God's will. About 7 weeks ago, I visited Kwang Lim Methodist Church in Seoul, Korea, with my friend and classmate in the doctoral program. It is the largest Methodist church in the world with 95,000 members. Bishop Kim Sundo pastored that church from 1970 to 2000, is almost 90 years old, and still preaches almost every Sunday at one of their locations in Seoul. In looking back over his life and ministry with Kwang Lim, Bishop Kim Sundo writes in his autobiography, A Miracle of 5 Minutes. I heard the commission that led me to pray, Lord, grant me a church that can serve nations around the world. Grant me a church that can embrace the world and guide lost souls before you. I started to dream of a church that would seek more than simple growth, a church that would not simply chase after growth for the sake of growth, but growth to serve and share. God blessed my prayers and allowed me to set up Kwang Lim Church. This was his prayer long before Kwang Lim Church was built, and in my mind creates wonder about the relationship between God's providence and prayer, and stepping out in bold faith and seeking the holiness of God in our lives and in our community. During our time there and studying the church and its ministries, we gained perspective on the providential blessings of God that flowed through that church and that pastor's leadership. It was an amazing church, amazing ministries that continue to bless those throughout South Korea and those throughout the world today. As providence would have it, on our last afternoon in Seoul, we discovered through TripAdvisor that the #1 visitor site in Seoul was the grave of the first Methodist missionary to Korea, Gerhard Appenzeller, 1858 to 1902. And so we rented bicycles, traveled along the Han River through Seoul, and spent about an hour in utter amazement of all the life stories that were described alongside the tombstones in this missionary cemetery with plaques. Here is Mr. Appenzeller's grave and plaque, which shares that he led the way in founding the cornerstone of the Korean Methodist Church. He established Pai Che School and First Methodist Church Cheongdong, and participated in the Korean translation of the Bible. He died in 1902 at the age of 44 on the way to a Bible translation committee trying to save a girl from drowning. To hear his story and the story of many others who gave their lives for meaningful Christian service in Korea within the past 130 years was a step back in time for us and offered for us the unique vantage point to see the roots of the best of the church that we had so powerfully just witnessed days before. You see, it's when you look back that you can best see the providence of God at work in those that encourage and strength step forward and offer God their very best when you have a fuller picture than before. That's what Joseph was blessed to see. As he said, "You meant to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." When we look back on our lives, we too just might be able to see the providence of God at work there. Even through the tough times, even when we can't see it, we can still trust that it's there. For most of the time, this is all we see, our own small little puzzle piece. We see a lot of other pieces too, ones that seem to some that seem to fit in neatly with ours and others that don't. But by faith, we trust that God's greater picture and God's will is being carried out, and trust that eventually the pieces will come together according to the will and plans of God the Father. Our invitation today is to offer ourselves up to God, to be part of a bigger plan than just what we want out of life. What God's will and work of redemption is accomplishing in the world is a much bigger and a much better picture. And though we may be the tormented or the tormentors in this world, Christ is calling us all and inviting us to lay down our selfish ambitions and jealousies and to give ourselves to his higher causes until on one final day, God's end game will be fully played out when Christ returns in final victory for the redemption and judgment of the world, for the resurrection of the dead, and the consummation of all things to the glory of God. Amen.